Herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being black here in the dawning of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk. And I think I can say without exaggeration that this is one of the most important books in American history. Because this is one of the first books that does a really good job diagnosing the problem of racial inequality in the United States. And again, as Du Bois opens with this very famous idea, this famous line that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Du Bois is very interesting and very important because he grows up in the late 19th century. He is extremely well educated for anybody in the late 19th century, let alone an African American. And African Americans had a much harder time accessing education, accessing literacy, basic knowledge than white Americans did. So the fact that he was extremely well educated, having gone to a very, very good primary school and gotten university degrees, he was an exceptional figure in the 19th century. One of these great rationalist intellectuals who comes along in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century. And actually in the introduction here by B Gibson, in this Penguin Classics edition that I'm reading, Gibson says, Du Bois was a firm believer in the efficacy of intellectual endeavor and in the power of logic and reason to persuade people of goodwill to do as they should, to follow the dictates of their values, both political and moral. Hence, his arguments are based on the professed values of the society at large. If one accepts rationality as a value, if one adheres to Christianity or to humanism, if one places faith in the Constitution and in the principles of democracy in general, then certain corollaries follow. Du Bois insists that reasonable men may argue reasonably together and that reason will prevail. And this is a really important assessment of Du Bois's contribution, not only in The Souls of Black Folk, but in his other books as well. Because he's one of the first writers who takes this stance of rationality and following the consequences of particular value systems and looks at African American experience in a systematic way. And it's not just about showing that African Americans need better access to education or that they need more resources. We need to be less racist, although all of that stuff is in there. Du Bois takes a really sophisticated approach to assessing the general conditions experienced by African Americans based on his wide variety of experiences, his wide variety of observations, etc., etc. And central to his argument is the importance of education for African Americans. And this is really one of Du Bois's big contributions, and still sort of ongoing today in terms of inequality of access for different ethnic or racial groups in the U.S. But one of the things that he talks about in the essay Of the Dawn of Freedom is the central role played by the Freedmen's Bureau during the Reconstruction period immediately after the Civil War in terms of setting up educational opportunities. So he says, the greatest success of the Freedmen's Bureau lay in the planting of the free schools among Negroes, and the idea of free elementary education among all classes in the South. All classes in the South. It not only called the schoolmistresses through the benevolent agencies and built them schoolhouses, but it helped discover and support such apostles of human culture as Edmund Ware, Samuel Armstrong, and Erastus Cravat. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that last name right. I've never heard of Cravat. The opposition to Negro education in the South was at first bitter and showed itself in ashes, insult, and blood. For the South believed an educated Negro to be a dangerous Negro, and the South was not wholly wrong. For education among all kinds of men always has had and always will have an element of danger and revolution, of dissatisfaction and discontent. Nevertheless, men strive to know. Perhaps some inkling of this paradox, even in the unquiet days of the Bureau, helped the bayonets allay in opposition to human training, which still today lies smoldering in the South, but not flaming. Fisk, Atlanta, Howard, and Hampton were founded in those days, and $6 million were expended for educational work, $750,000 of which the freedmen themselves gave of their poverty. So, this is one of Du Bois's central concerns, is how to educate African Americans effectively in a segregated, racially unequal society. And he's got an essay, a very interesting essay, I think it's Of the Meaning of Progress, where he basically talks about, like, during summers when he was in school at Fisk in Tennessee, or he would go out into like the backwoods of Tennessee and like find these communities. And I guess this was what Fisk students just did. They would go out and like find these communities, and basically they would work over the summer teaching school for these communities. And that was a big part of their training and their education in that program. But education is not a simple thing for Du Bois. And that's one of the really interesting things. He has a whole essay in here entitled Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, where he basically rips apart Booker T. Washington, who at the time was the most influential African American, who was a big supporter of African American education. But, and this is the important point that Du Bois makes, he was a supporter of a very specific kind of African American education, i.e., job training, industrial training, and agricultural training. Washington was not necessarily a supporter of, like, go and learn the classics, go and learn languages, go and learn what we would now call the arts and humanities. He didn't necessarily believe in liberal arts education. He didn't necessarily believe in what we would typically cover in like four-year universities and things like this. Washington wanted a service-oriented African-American population, and Du Bois rips him apart for this. Like, Du Bois is basically like, of all of the major players, of all of the sort of major influential figures in the history of African-American liberation, Washington has done the most to undermine actual movements toward freedom and equality by trying to cement African Americans as a laboring class. So Du Bois has this, again, great insight and this great rational approach wherein he says, if this is what we strive for, this is what's going to be the result. And if these are the values that we espouse, this is the way that we need to go about trying to achieve those results. The other great insight of the souls of black folk is this idea that Du Bois has a double consciousness. So he says here, of our spiritual strivings, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So this idea of double consciousness is really important in terms of understanding the African American experience, and also probably like the Afro-Caribbean experience, the Afro-Canadian experience, etc., etc. Now, it's an interesting thing because later on, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and the existentialists would come along and say, well, actually, everybody, well, they didn't say this as a response to Du Bois, but like Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, one of his big ideas is that as existential beings, we always see ourselves through the eyes of the other. We come to sort of recognize, we have our own sense of ourselves, but then at the same time, once we become an object for the other, we can't help but feel ourselves as an object. And existentially, that's true, I think. I'm on board with Sartre's position here. Du Bois is taking this, a very similar idea, but it's working at more of an existential, or it's not an existential, it's working at more of a political or cultural level. So, African Americans, presumably, like everyone else in existential philosophy, have a sort of doubled externality, like have a sense of themselves, but also experience themselves as an object for others. But this is Du Bois's point. In America, in the US, the African American's experience is always doubled by race. So there's always a sense of being an American and being African. So that term African American in this case is, like, the fact that it's doubled is what Du Bois says is double consciousness. To not just be that an African American never experiences him or herself, themselves, purely as an American. They never experience themselves purely as an African. They experience themselves always as both and neither at the same time. Never American enough, never African enough, but always American and always African. And there's a self-division that Du Bois talks about that's central to his diagnosis of African American experience. And this is an idea that later post-colonial and critical race thinkers pick up on and becomes really, really central. So, like Aimé Césaire, for instance, I want to say he's from Martinique, but that seems wrong to me. He's a Caribbean poet, post-colonial thinker, etc., etc. He talks about this. Frantz Fanon in Black Skins, White Masks talks about not sort of realizing what it means that he's black until he goes to France and is treated as black. It's the same kind of thing that Du Bois says is at the center of African American experience. To always be aware of one's blackness because one encounters it. It is imposed upon one. And again, this is something that Du Bois is very centrally concerned with.